Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast, celebrating filmmaking, storytelling and cinema across the island of Ireland. Today we have a very special podcast supported by Screen Ireland, who are partnering with the Irish Film Classification Office, IFCO, to invite film enthusiasts to cover the world of film classification and view a curated selection of short films on Culture Night on Friday the 19th of September. So we are delighted to welcome Director of Film Classification, Dr. Ciarán Kissane. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Delighted. Thanks for the invitation.
We're delighted. I was wondering if you could start by describing the role and responsibilities of the Director of Film Classification. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, it's to oversee all the operations of the office, but the main function of the office set down in two pieces of legislation. The first one, going back to 1923, is to view and issue classifications for all content that is going into cinemas in Ireland. So that covers cinema content, but also trailers, short films, and that are going to be shown to a public audience. And also we have responsibility under legislation from 1990 in relation to home entertainment, but that's physical sales of home entertainment. So that is material that's available to purchase, Blu-rays, DVDs, that kind of material. So we view that material and then issue classifications that are set out in terms of, there's different ones for cinema than for home entertainment, but they're generally aligned. And the thing that I often say is that the home entertainment ones, because they're point of purchase rather than viewing, because that's where the regulation is implemented. But equally, there are, if people use the guidance we gave, they're useful from a viewing perspective as well, but they primarily are ones that are dealing with the point of sale. But the majority of our work is linked to cinema. So in 2024, and these stats are available on our website, we looked at nearly 1,000 pieces of home entertainment content, which included over 900 features, extras and bonus. And on the cinema side, it was almost 1,400 pieces of cinema content. 580 of those were features and 700 were trailers. So there's a lot of content that comes through the office on an annual basis. And we publish stats on our website which give a breakdown in terms of where the ratings were, also the origin of the content. People are often surprised that we get so much content that is produced in India. So in 2024, that was 24% of all the content that we viewed. America was only responsible for 23% of the content. So India, the Indian subcontinent, was the largest production base of content that was going into Irish cinemas. But that's not the whole story, because the content that is in the top 25 from a box office perspective is generally the US continent. And interesting, last year there were a couple of ones which had Irish connections, like Small Things Like These was at number 11, took in nearly 2.5 million in the Irish box office. And Kneecap, the controversial Kneecap, took in over 1.1 million in the box office, and that was at number 25. So none of those films from the Indian subcontinent make their way into the top 25, but they are in the top 100. So there's a complexity to the story as well.
And in terms of content for streamers, does that, like, is it only as it's coming into like the physical DVD, and is that something that you leave to the streamers themselves to do unless it's being disseminated in a different way?
We don't have any statutory remit in relation to streaming services, because they're under the regulation of Commission Iman, in the same way as Commission Iman are the responsible regulator for TV broadcast. So streaming and video on demand and some of those other elements are within the broadcast family of regulation. DVD physical distribution was seen to be within the cinema home entertainment, or the entertainment class, when that emerged as a big entity in the late 80s, early 90s. So that's why there's a sort of connection here with the home entertainment and the physical sales. But our primary business is cinema, and that's the main focus of the work we do and the main interest in the work we do as well.
And how many is in the team? How many, like, roughly would be kind of watching all those films?
Well, we're a very small team. So there's myself and 3 part-time assistant classifiers. So it's a very small team of classifiers, and then we're supported by 4 staff that are seconded from the civil service. So it used to be the Department of Justice, but from the 1st of August, we have moved over to the Department of Culture, Communications and Sport. So now we're part of that department, which is a significant shift in terms of that, I suppose, transition from the whole censorship era to classification, and it connects us more within that media regulation space than the law and order space, which would be more related to justice.
And I know you are from the media regulation side yourself. I'm going to go into your like just your path and how you got here and your own expertise in a little while, but I would like just kind of dig into the office as well. What are the skill sets that one has to acquire to work in this division? Is it like a mix of all areas and everyone benefits?
Well, there's a lot of administration and governance, which, you know, we're a body under the Code of Governance for State Bodies, so there's a lot of administrative work like that, and you know, general work that's required to run an office. And then in terms of looking at the actual content itself, I think it's one where you've got to understand how to apply a set of codes and standards to a piece of content, looking at specific issues that are relevant in the context of whatever the code. So for us, it's sexual content, it's violence, it's language, and looking at thematic pieces. And then based on that, make a decision about what is the most suitable rating, applying the code that's there. So a lot of it is critical analysis, content analysis, and then staying focused on what are the issues that we have been tasked with looking at. So where that differs from broadcast, because I worked a lot, as you said previously, on the broadcast side, is, you know, we don't have to deal with fairness, objectivity and impartiality, you know, which was something which I had a lot of experience with doing in the broadcasting side. We don't look at that. And even though sometimes people will send us feedback and say this wasn't fairly treated, that's not how we're looking at it. We're looking at it in terms of the way the content is done from a thematic, and also sexual content, violence, harmful behaviour, as we've changed that from drugs under our revision to the code earlier on this year, and then language.
I was wondering if you could kind of break it down as to examples as to how that would work. If you had a film and, you know, like there's like a butt in a non-sexual context, and then it's like something that is quite sexual, what are the kind of benchmarks for this? We'd recommend it as this, and this is what we'd recommend it as this?
Well, we sort of set that out. We published a new guide for our classifications in June of this year, and that sort of breaks it down in terms of each of the different categories. So I would suggest people to have a look at that, and we got it written. Nala did a plain English version of it, so hopefully people will be better able to understand it. But essentially, we take the piece of content in whole and in context. And, you know, it's not about applying, well, if there's, you know, 4 uses of the F word, it's going to get a particular rating, because you have to look at how different things are treated, and also the extent to which they're contextually justified within the narrative and the story. And that's you know, something which very much comes up around sexual content and around violent content, where, you know, well, is it needed in the context of the story you need to tell, and is it needed in terms of the way it has been treated on screen? And that being said, so there's some of the mitigating factors that can give you a lower rating, and also if it's historically justified in terms of language, or if it's animated characters or fantasy characters and not real characters. So there's a range of factors that come in. So it's not only looking at, you know, the language, the violence, the sexual content and the harmful behavior, it's taking it in the context of the story that's been told and how it's been treated, and the nature of the characters, and also the resolution. So there's a lot at play in terms of making any decision. And also I think it's worth highlighting that the majority of the ratings that we give are in the advisory categories of PG, 12A and 15A. And the A there means that somebody who's under that particular age, so 12A, someone under 12, can go if they're accompanied. And, you know, a parent or guardian has taken the view, looking at our advice and the issues that we've raised about that particular piece of content, that it is suitable for that young person. And that's really at the heart of the role of the office, is to provide that guidance and advice, so parents, guardians and young people themselves can make an informed decision about what they're going to view in the cinema context, and home entertainment, but mainly it's the cinema context.
And where you get your guidelines or build your guidelines from, I know before it's interesting going from that kind of almost control and justice. There's a penal idea to this is what you should be doing. This is, this guideline element. Where do you kind of get your set of guidelines? Would you have other nations that you'd use as a benchmark? Is it something that's chatted about in Brussels?
Well, the legislation we operate under is still the 1923 Act. So it's the same legislation that was there, and there's some small tweaks, but the significant change that was made in, I think it was 2008, was the change of the C from censorship to classification. So the office still operates under the same legislation. In terms of the guidelines, when I came in to the role in March 2023, it was one of the things I identified was a need to review and update the guidelines. And we took a number of different approaches to that. First of all, we looked at them internally based on our own experience. I was looking at some research had been done that was published in 2023, which looked at some of the public attitudes to the work we were doing and the kinds of areas that we were focusing in. And so we brought that on board. We also started a program of classification workshops where we bring people in and we chat to them about the work that we do, and we get them to classify a piece of content with us. Now, it's not scientific, so we're a small office, we've done it in conjunction with Culture Night, we've done it in conjunction with some festivals. But I would say over the last 2 years, we've probably had, over 400 people involved in those classification workshops. So that gives us some valuable feedback from the public as well. And then we did look at what was happening in other jurisdictions, but they were an evolution rather than a revolution. And the guidelines were something which were drawn up about 20 years ago and have evolved since then and are working quite well. So when we looked at what we needed to change, we put these out for consultation, and we got some feedback from people, and that then fed into the final version. And one of the most significant changes was we have a grid where we look at four specific categories and we give advice around those. And up onto these guidelines, the fourth category was drugs, which was, to my mind, a bit narrow, and also based on the feedback we got from the public, where people were saying we want, greater level of information around things like suicide and things like that. So we changed that category to harmful behaviour, which would reflect, what is done more generally in other jurisdictions and also in other areas like broadcasting. And we just updated some of the connections between our home entertainment categorizations and the cinema one, so people could see a better connection and tie those together. So, and then putting it in plain English, I thought was a significant step, because it meant that hopefully they will be easier for people, especially young people, to understand and reference. So they're not based in statute, because we're still operating under the same statute, but they're based in custom and practice here, but also based on reflections of best practice in other jurisdictions and also other regulatory spaces here.
Very interesting. And in terms of harmful behaviors, things like hate speech that have probably evolved, like coercive control, like
bullying,
assault,
all of those.
Yeah. So in terms of guidelines as well for trigger warnings, is there a sort of best practice recommendations that you might have for filmmakers as someone who's literally sitting down going?
No, I think, especially more commercial films are very conscious of the rating that they will get, and especially ones that are, produced internationally in the States and places like that. They're very conscious of the rating they will get in their main market, which is usually the United States. I would suggest to people that often, you can, with just some small look at the guidelines, make something that will actually maybe sit at a more suitable place for your piece of content. And if anybody has any questions, I'd encourage them to talk to us about it. But generally, people are conscious of what ratings they're going to get in various markets. And as I say, I find the 15A rating here very useful, because it's one which allows us to rate content with a significant age bracket identified with it, but also allowing some flexibility. So the 12A and the 15A and the PG, allowing people that flexibility to say, well, you can make an informed decision both for yourself, but also for the young person under your care, allows at least a greater scope of content to be made available. And I think having that 15A and having a hard 16 and a hard 18 allows us also to differentiate between those more challenging pieces of content. So I think the structure here works very well, and we didn't propose any changes, and no one has suggested to us that we would that any changes were required there, so we have left them as they are.
When something sits on a line, that it could go either way, that you're taking it in a holistic space where you're assessing all of the various elements in the context, which is so important because, yeah, drug use in one instance could be deemed as promotional and irresponsible, and another like a cautionary tale, and that but like things that kind of fall on that line. Is there any procedures or anything like that in place? Like is there ever like the kind of hearty discussion of
Yeah, like even like content that you think is going to be less controversial or easier to rate can often raise issues. And we would, like, ideally, you would have two views on everything, but we just don't have the resources to do that. So what we do is tend to prioritize ones that are going to be seen by more people in ensuring that there are two views on those. But it is a challenge if you only have one person viewing a piece of content. And we have a good team who, if there's something that is particularly challenging, that they will identify that, and somebody else will go and have a look at it. And so we try and at least ensure that the bigger films, as I said, will have at least two views on them. But there's a balance, because to my mind, one of the objectives is to try and make a diversity of content and as much content available for people to go and view and make up their own minds about. And that's where that 15A, 12A and PG is very useful, because you can say, well, look, yes, it is only suitable for people over a certain age, but there is some scope for people to, depending on what they feel most sensitive about, to view it. But when you talk about ones that are borderline, like there was a lot of debate here and in other jurisdictions independently, but it was interesting around the Bob Marley One Love film, because there is drug use in it, but it's part of the story. And we debated that and we gave it a 12A. And interestingly, lots of other jurisdictions had the same issue and went for the lower rating, because historically it wasn't glamorized in the film. It was there, it was in the background, and historically it was something that you had to have to make the film accurate. And we actually did a workshop on it with transition year students, didn't tell them what the issue was, and we got we screened it for them. They didn't know what they were going to screen. We talked them through the classifications. They identified that the issue within the film was mainly around the drug use, and they came down with a 12A in the end. Now, we'd already made the decision, but it was a useful way to test that back with a group, especially a group who were young people in that space. And in other jurisdictions, they had a similar debate around that film and came out with a lower rating on it. And that's where the ratings evolve. And there are ones where, you've got to take a view. We've got to publish that before the film is released. And the other thing that we do take into account in the context of the guidelines, in the context of our work, are feedback and complaints from the audience. And we get very few complaints around the classification decisions. So I think people, and the research has shown there's a lot of trust in the work that we do and a lot of recognition of it. But equally, we do try and move with the audience, and that's where research is critical for us. We're coming to the end of a very significant piece that we are doing in partnership with Commission Naman and with the Office of the Children's Ombudsman, which will be published hopefully in October this year, where we looked at adults' attitudes both in quantitative way but also through focus groups, and then also at young people's attitudes, under 12s and 12 to 17-year-olds in focus groups around the same types of content and types of issues. And that'll, I think, has been very useful, especially given that it is in a post-COVID context, where there's so much viewing being done by people on their own, on smaller screens, and the world of content that people are viewing has expanded hugely, especially for younger people. And so I think there's some very interesting findings in that, which are already, because it's active research, have already been playing into some of our decisions. But I'm anxious to get it published and see what people think.
You must have such a huge workload. Like even the fact that, okay, that's like over 20% of the films that you're watching are from India. How do you manage the workflow to get them out? Because everything has a deadline, everything has a time that it comes out.
Yeah, and we don't have any way to control it. So, like, we came in this morning and a new piece of content, because people at distributor had secured the rights for it. We got an email to say it's coming in, and they hope to have it in cinemas next week. So we have to try and manage that and with trailers, we don't have any control over. Lots of big films will have well over 10 trailers. So it is a challenge, and it does require flexibility within the team. And we have a good relationship with the distributors as well. So we ask them to give us as much notice as possible, and we try and meet their timeframes. But it is a challenge.
Because that's it. It's just a thing where all the films come out on a specific date, or that's like the season. And then if you're getting things from totally different pools, just landing in your desk. And like, I mean, films can be like 3.5 hours long.
Yeah. There's one being screened at the moment, an Indian language film, which is over 3 hours long. So there's one of my colleagues is in looking at that this morning, so it is a challenge, but and that's where we have to try and balance the number of views you have on different things. So we work within the resources we have, and we generally, there's never an issue in terms of deadlines being met for distributors, and they work with us as much as possible. And the other pressure that's there for some distributors is getting access to screen space as well. So sometimes plans change. So we try and show as much flexibility as we can.
What's your setup when you go in to see and watch your films? Do you have is it just on a small screen? Do you have like a comfy little space?
We have a 15-seater cinema here. So that's what we use for Culture Night. And we're doing screenings next week for Heritage Week. One of the landmark pieces we did for the centenary is we commissioned a documentary which looks at the censorship period. And John Kelleher, who was the last official censor and the first director of classification, presented it. And it's really, really good. It's about 75 minutes long, but it tells the story through individual films. So if you were with screenings next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 2:30 in the afternoon, there's a limited number of seats. But you can, if you're around as part of your research for this piece, let me know, and I'll put your name on one of the seats.
Oh, that sounds brilliant. Okay, I'll put that in my calendar and do an announcement. That sounds so.
And we'll be doing other screenings. We're going to do a special one in Cork in conjunction with the Cork Film Festival, because one of the previous censors was the director of Cork Film Festival, and they're 70 years. So they sort of crossed a lot of that, and they're part of the story in terms of a lot of the films that were shown there. So there are other opportunities to see it, but it's a really landmark piece. And also, given that film, theatre and drama are now on the Leaving Cert cycle, and we did some work with them in terms of helping the team there to understand the work we do in the classifications. So I'm hoping there would be interest from schools, people who are studying that area in terms of looking at this as part of the story.
Because I would say as well, you probably accrue a great deal of knowledge about such a huge cross section of film doing that job.
Yeah, and previously I spent 10 years running the Broadcast Fund, which funds a lot of content here, but it's at a different level in terms of it tends to be non-commercial content, whereas a lot of material that we look at is by its very nature commercial content, because someone is deciding that they're going to distribute it into cinema and sell tickets for it. So they believe there's a commercial space for it. So yeah, you see a different mix of content. There's an overlap, of course, but yeah, it is interesting to see the extent to which formulas are applied as well, because you get to see sort of everything that's going out nearly. So, things like, well, they're the franchise and the same stories and bits like that. So it is, it's for someone who's very interested in film and having studied it, it's a privilege to watch some of those. You don't enjoy everything, but
yeah, I was going to say it's a privilege to watch some, and then it might be a bit more of a chore, because like you're going in with that more deeper understanding, so you can kind of like see where the cogs aren't cogging.
Yeah, but also you watch stuff that you might not have picked in a purely recreational sense to go and watch. So I've watched more horror in the last 2 years than I'd say I watched in the previous 20. Wouldn't be my genre, but it's interesting to get immersed in it because there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah, and the fans are so intense that you're like, yeah, you can see that. And things like horror as well. Like, so that's a very interesting one to come down. And just as a viewer, right? There's different types of gore. There's gore that is very authentic and visceral, and then there's that very cartoonish, like, like like an obviously puppet head gets squished and it's kind of funny. Is there like a kind of discussion to be had, or like that you guys are having behind the closed doors, as be like, no, that the eyeball was too realistic? Like how, like especially in terms of this, what, like how do you classify
Yeah,
that?
there is, because and also it evolves. So an interesting one last year for the 40th anniversary, Warner Brothers resubmitted Nightmare on Elm Street, and it got an 18s when it was originally rated, and we looked at it again and we gave it a 15A, and part of that reflects, those effects have come on because the blood didn't really look real. It wasn't as terrifying as content that would be there now. And also, I think people who go to Nightmare on Elm Street, it looks a lot, it looks very dated at this point. Now, fans will always be fans, but in terms of the shock effect that it will have on an audience and the effect of other content that audiences are seeing, it seemed more reasonable at a 15A rather than an 18s at this stage. So the ratings do move on and they do evolve. And we give I think it's less than 10% of what we did last year got a 16 or an 18. So we only give 12 films out of 665 an 18 rating. So having the 16 and the 18 is very useful because it allows us to differentiate between the really more challenging content and stuff that probably is, yeah, it's in a horror space, but it's not very bloody, very gory, very violent.
And do you think that is that audiences have adapted, the way we consume media has adapted? Like there's a real, like by the time you're 15, you really understand this is not true, as opposed to before when there was a big separation between, the like film on a big screen and an individual, and seeing that might have been more shocking.
I think cinema is still very immersive. It's still very powerful. At the size of the screen and the sound and all of that, you've got to take all of that into account. And that's why I think it's important that we see this material in a cinema setting. You know what I mean? So you're not watching it on a small screen. Now we do have to watch a certain amount of material on links, but I tend to try and make sure there's no distraction so you're focused on it, because that's the experience that somebody will have watching it in the cinema. But especially for bigger releases, you need to be immersed in it to really be able to see all the nuances as well. But I think audiences have evolved, and that's why the research is very important, because this came up in research that others have done, but the children are getting access to independent devices at an earlier and earlier age. And COVID really switched that, because, I had 3 children who were under 15, the lowest only been 10 in when COVID hit. And, the advice had always been, if you're going to have a computer, it's in a public space, it's all monitored. And then overnight you were told, get them a computer-aided device, send them to their bedroom and close the door so they can go to school. But it was an internet-enabled device that they had, and the genie was out of the bottle. And that was very much came up in some of the feedback we got in the focus groups we did with children. So there's a generation now that are the COVID generation, for want of a better term, who've had a whole different media experience, and as part of that have been exposed to a lot more content. Because this is what they said to us in the research, that the majority of people, their biggest concern was around material on YouTube. That's what they were watching. So I think, and that's not our responsibility, Commission are involved in that space, but I think there is an evolution of the audience, and we have to try and reflect that, but also be mindful of our responsibilities in terms of protecting children and vulnerable adults, and also providing advice that does that, and recognizing the cinema setting that's there. So it is a balance, but the balance is not stuck in time, it evolves.
And I know, like the days of banning films are gone, and that's it. But like just emotionally, was there any films that you were like, oh my God, I would love to have banned that?
No, I'm very much
Yuck.
driven by the fact that, nobody's forced to go in and watch it, and
Yeah.
people need to, make their own decisions. And I think having a diversity of content that people can see,
Yeah.
and it really helps people to be able to engage with cinema and be able to engage with content. And that is part of our mission and vision here, is to try and make as much content available as possible, and a diversity of content for audiences to make up their own mind, and to facilitate them to do that in a very informed way.
Yeah, and I kind of rephrase it because actually that was probably a terrible. It's more like you have to watch certain films because I just know myself, my tolerance to gore has gone so. I used to just watch anything, and now it's gone so short. Are there days when you go in and you're like, Jesus, that was a difficult watch?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And things that you wouldn't really be interested in, or and also because of, you can't turn away. You've got to watch it all the way through. You've got to look at that, and sometimes you've got to watch it the second time.
Like, did someone watch a Serbian film and they were like,
Yeah, but that's, as you say, some of them are great, and some of them, there's there's always an upside and a downside to everything.
that it's the trauma of it. Yeah, I suppose that's it. Like it's a cool job as well. Like at the end of the day, it is. You're gonna get your clangers. And tell me about what was your journey to get here?
I suppose there's no set journey to get here, but essentially, I was always interested in film and television, and I worked as a journalist. I also studied it in college, and so it was always an area that interested me, and the rules and regulations around it always did as well. So I spent almost 30 years working in different versions of the Irish Broadcasting Regulator after being a journalist. So there was a synergy of being used to rules, codes, and rules, used to how an organisation worked, and then this came up, and I said that's a nice fit, and it'll be a different fit to the work that I was doing. So I applied and was lucky enough to get it. So I think that's one of the things that everyone has their own journey to a certain extent.
Yeah. And but even in terms of going into journalism from college, going to like I even think that's a kind of interesting transition because there's someone sort of bringing you on that. I was wondering if we could go into that a little bit more, how the ebb and flow of that happened.
Well, there's always luck, and you meet different people along the way. And I suppose I was uh, lucky that when I left college, the whole local radio scene was beginning to evolve here. So there was work there in a way that there wasn't work previous to that. And then, from there into the regulatory side, because there was an expansion in terms of the work that was being done there. And I was,
That was the leap that I don't see that I was like, that's a very different job.
yeah. And to be honest, at the time, I'd been involved in community radio groups, and they were looking for someone who would support the development of that. So there's a policy development piece around community. So it was a hands-on piece around looking at policy, but also how these stations could evolve, how they might work in terms of as a new model. So you needed to have a level of practitioner experience plus an understanding of some of the rules and the policies and some of those other pieces. So that was my sort of journey in, that they were looking for someone who had that unique sort of fit at that point. And I was lucky enough to get that policy role, and we wrote a policy for community broadcasting, which is still in place today, and there's still stations that are operating under it. And then different elements emerged in the regulatory space, because one of the unique things about the Irish Broadcasting Regulator for a number of years was its involvement in development as well as regulation. And I was always more on the development side, because that was where the community piece was. It was to write the policies, but help the stations to develop. And then there was the evolution into the broadcast fund, where there was a fund set aside to support content, and I ran that for 10 years. So there was a regulatory piece, but it was always had a developmental element to the work I was doing generally. I think that suited me, but also that helped this transition here, where we're trying to look at how we can broaden the role of the office and engage more with the audiences, and things like the workshops and elements like that, which I've introduced, are coming from that side of saying we want to develop people's understanding of what we do and help them to help us to do a better job as well.
We really are at a juncture in terms of how we're consuming content, how everything is sort of shifting. how stories are being consumed, how like short form stories are kind of changing the way that we engage with that content and like even process it. Do you notice, as someone who just watches like a load of films, like can you see those things evolve? Because I'd say there's probably no one in the world who like, or in the entire country, that just sits and watches so many different things coming in.
I think there's always evolution, but also there's a sense that people keep going back to the same stories, you know. So last week we watched the remake of The War of the Roses, you know, and so while there are new ideas coming, there's still a strong reliance on older ideas and telling older stories, maybe with a new twist on them. So uh, I'm not sure there's as much uh, dynamism in that sector as there are in some of the short form stuff, because some of the stuff that's done for shorts is really, really interesting, really innovative. And we're doing a program in conjunction with Screen Ireland for Culture Night this year, which I'm delighted to be partnering with them, where we're going to show some of their shorts, and they're doing the programming for different age groups and chat about why they get a particular rating. So we'll have slots available. Again, it's bringing people into our cinema to look at shorts and chat about those, because they're really an interesting way to look at some of those issues around how content is evolving.
I suppose that's the next generation of Irish filmmakers. And in terms of Irish film, so you guys have been getting a lot more Irish content across your desk. You were involved in commissioning Irish content. I was just wondering if you can kind of speak to how our Indigenous film industry, like the changes that you've seen over the years.
Well, I think the amount of content, it used to be that if there was an Irish film, you know, one or two might come out a year. Now there's so much really interesting and diverse content being produced, and I think that's great. And one of the things that we have done is try to engage more with the festivals here to provide a structure whereby if content which may not be as commercially attractive to distributors, that we can then look at it, and we have a structure under the legislation which goes back to 1923, which allows us to issue a cert without charge. And so we do that, but we can't do it for everything because we've got to manage the workflow that comes through. But we've proactively gone out and tried to partner up with festivals and also with, you know, other people who can help us, like Screen Ireland, in terms of getting content in where we will give it a cert and it will go on the file. And then if they can find a space where they can be exhibited, they have a cert. The cert doesn't become the barrier. It may not be the enabler, but it actually, at least they're able to do that. And that's why the amount of Irish content that we have certified each year has gone up. A lot of that has been done on a non-commercial basis to support Irish content creators. And I think it's great, the innovation that's there, especially in some of the documentaries and shorts that people are making.
That's amazing. The pool of talent, the stories being told, the types of stories. Is there anything that you're observing there? Because you're getting them changing every year.
Not anything since I've started here. Like you know, over the last number of years, I think the diversity in terms of the as I said, the short stories that the short films that people have been making, but also I think when you look at the impact that incoming production has had on, you know, skills based, the talent based, and also the ability for people not only to view things from the perspective of getting an Irish audience for it, but also to look at how you might get an international audience. And the story I often tell is I was involved in funding on Klondike, which was a Western, 5-part Western made by Abu Media, shot in Connemara about 10 years ago. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a look. So it was shot, it was for Teachie Cahir, and they then were able to repackage it for Netflix for a period of time as Dominion Creek, but it was the same content. So here you had a Western shot in Connemara in the Irish language that found a home on Netflix. And I thought that just was a great sentiment. So it still had a rooted Irish story, still was rooted in being produced in Ireland. It gave a platform to the language, but also because of the changes that are happening in terms of, you know, people accepting subtitles and, you know, the streaming platforms, that it was able to find a place on Netflix as well. So I think innovation, it's great to see things like that happening.
God, that's so exciting. It's lovely. Yeah, it is. And yeah, like, and films like Kneecap on Colin Kuhn and how broadly they travel and they connect to people. What do you see as the future for the role? Like, it seems to be something that has been consistently evolving. Is there any kind of things on the cusp that you're working towards that you can see on the horizon?
Well, we're in the process of reviewing our current strategy, so we'll be looking at putting out a new strategy later on this year. I think that sense of evolution, now that we've got the new guidelines in place, and I think the expanding role of cinema in Irish society, but also in terms of the number of outlets that are there, it is expected that the audiences will continue to grow, and I think it's how we can ensure that we're there to support that and have the capacity to support it, but also to bring that focus on a diversity of content for Irish audiences. To me, that's critical in terms of being able to say, well, look, we want you, of course, there's going to be a lot of interest in the big blockbusters, but there's other stuff that needs to be on screen, especially European content and things like that. And there's really good material. And I think that helps to broaden the discussion around the issues that are raised through film, but also to see things from different perspectives. So I think we still have a core role in terms of providing information and guidance, but I think if we can in some way help to ensure that there is a diversity of content available for audiences to have a look at or even think about by coming and looking at what we've said about it, I think that'll be a continued focus in the new strategy.
Thank you so much for chatting with us. That was just fascinating.
Great, and thanks you. And if it does suit you, come in and have a look at the censorship documentary. It's great.
So thanks so much for listening. So make sure to rate and subscribe to Film Ireland wherever you get your podcasts. And for news, reviews and events, subscribe to our newsletter at filmireland.ie.